We're now in public session to discuss the impact of homelessness on children. I welcome members and also viewers who may be watching our proceedings on Oireachtas TV to the public session of the joint Oireachtas Committee on Children and Youth Affairs. The purpose of today's meeting is to meet with officials from the Department of Housing, Planning and Local Government and the Department of Children and Youth Affairs in Tusla, the Child and Family Agency, to discuss the impact of homelessness on children. On behalf of the committee, I welcome Ms Mary Hurley, Assistant Secretary, Department of Housing, Planning and Local Government, Mr David Kelly, Principal Officer, Housing Delivery Division, Department of Housing, Planning and Local Government, Mr Albert O'Donoghue, Principal Officer, Alternative Care Policy from the Department of Children and Youth Affairs, Mr Jim Gibson, Chief Operations Officer from Tusla, and Mr Cormac Quinlan, Director of Transformation and Policy from Tusla. And just a brief notary privilege, which no doubt you've all heard numerous times before, but I have to do it. So before we commence, in accordance with procedure, I'm required to draw your attention to the fact that by virtue of Section 17(2)(l) of the Defamation Act, witnesses are protected by absolute privilege in respect of their evidence to this committee. However, if you're directed by the committee to cease giving evidence in relation to a particular matter and you continue to do so, you're entitled thereafter to only qualified privilege in respect of your evidence. You're directed that the only evidence connected with the subject matter of these proceedings is to be given by you, and you're asked to respect the parliamentary practice to the effect that where possible you should not criticise or make charges against any person, persons or entity by name or in such a way as to make him, her or it identifiable. Members are reminded of the long-standing parliamentary practice to the effect that members should not comment on, criticise or make charges against a person outside the Houses or an official either by name or in such a way as to make him, her or it identifiable. Mobile phones, I've already said this to members, but just to remind everybody to turn off their mobile phones as they interfere. I wish to advise you that any submission or opening statements you have made to the Joint Committee will be published on the Committee's website after this meeting, and after your presentation there will be questions from members, if that's okay. So I'll now call on Ms Hurley to make your opening statement when you're ready. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the committee for the invitation today to discuss the impact of homelessness on children. I'm accompanied today by my colleague David Kelly, Principal Officer with responsibility for the homelessness area at the Department of Housing, Planning and Local Government. In terms of context, I think it's important to note that the Department of Housing, Planning and Local Government is responsible for the provision of a national framework of policy, legislation and funding to underpin the role of housing authorities in addressing homelessness. Statutory responsibility for the provision of accommodation and related services rests with housing authorities. Accordingly, the Department does not fund any service directly, but provides funding to housing authorities to meet up to 90% of the costs incurred by those authorities. A large proportion of the funding is provided for services provided by non-governmental organisations who are contracted by the housing authorities. This includes emergency and supported accommodation arrangements, daytime services, outreach and tenancy sustainment. The response to resolving homelessness requires a multi-agency approach. A number of other departments and agencies are responsible for delivering supports to families and their children that are experiencing homelessness. These include the Department of Children and Youth Affairs, Tusla, the HSC and the Department of Education and Skills. In September 2017, Minister Murphy established the Homelessness Interagency Group to ensure that services to individuals, families and their children were provided in a coherent and coordinated manner. The group is chaired by Mr John Murphy, former Secretary-General in the Department of Jobs, Enterprise and Innovation. The root cause in the increase in homelessness is the shortage of supply across the housing sector. Key to resolving homelessness will be increasing the supply of social housing. Accordingly, Rebuilding Ireland, the Government's action plan on housing and homelessness, is designed to accelerate all types of housing supply, social, private and rental. During the lifetime of the plan, some 50,000 new social housing homes will be provided, supported by exchequer investment of over €6 billion, with 87,000 other housing supports delivered over the 6 years 2016 to 2021. In addition to this, housing output generally will be progressively increased towards the target of producing 25,000 houses per year through all channels. The plan provides for early solutions to address the high number of households in emergency accommodation, such as the delivery of independent tenancies through the various social housing supports programmes. This includes the delivery of increased social housing supply through new build, acquisition and refurbishment schemes, but also independent tenancies are being provided for homeless households in the private rented sector through housing supports such as the enhanced housing assistant payment. Where a family requires emergency accommodation, the Department is working with housing authorities to minimise the use of hotels through the development of family hubs. Family hubs offer a more suitable form of emergency accommodation with better facilities for families with children, including cooking facilities, laundry facilities and more recreational space. Families and hubs are supported by the service provider to identify and secure an independent tenancy, which would include a tenancy in a local authority property, a property provided by an approved housing body, or a tenancy in the private rented sector supported by the housing assistant payment. Family hubs are, though, very much a short-term solution and are not intended for long-term use. In April, the Office of the Children's Ombudsman published the No Place Like Home report on the experiences of children and their parents of young children in family hubs. Minister Murphy subsequently met with the Ombudsman on the subject. The Department is examining the recommendations in this report in consultation with the Homelessness Interagency Group. This examination also involves a consultation with the NGO service providers who are operating the hubs. The latest homelessness report published by the Department relates to May 2019. The report shows that during that month, 1,700 families and 3,749 children or other dependents of these families were accessing emergency accommodation. I want to assure the committee here today that delivering housing solutions for each of these families is an absolute priority for the Department. We are fully committed to ensuring the appropriate policy and funding framework is in place to deliver these solutions. In 2018, over 5,000 adults exited homelessness into an independent tenancy. Our priority is to ensure exits to tenancies for each of the families and other households currently in emergency accommodation. Moreover, prevention initiatives such as the HAP Place Finder service work with households at risk of homelessness to identify solutions to ensure that they do not have to enter emergency accommodation. For example, in Dublin, approximately half of the families presenting to homeless services each month are prevented from having to enter emergency accommodation. And we are also seeing significant numbers exiting emergency accommodation every month. In Dublin, for the first 5 months of the year, a total of 437 families entered emergency accommodation for the first time. However, during this period, 462 families were prevented from entering emergency accommodation, and 404 families exited emergency accommodation through the creation of 866 new tenancies. My colleagues and I are happy to discuss these and other issues here today and answer any questions that you have on this matter. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Hurley. I now call on Mr. O'Donoghue to make your opening statement, please.
Thank you, Chair. At the outset, I'd just like to take the opportunity to thank the committee for the invitation to attend here today and to discuss matters in relation to homelessness. As members of the committee will be aware, responsibility for addressing homelessness rests with colleagues in the Department of Housing, Planning and Local Government. But that said, the Department of Children and Youth Affairs, as well as colleagues in TUSLA and across the wider span of government service, our provision are anxious to assist in any way that we can. The Department has taken a number of steps working within its particular remit to help in alleviating the difficulties experienced by children and families who are homeless. Representatives of the Department participate in the Homeless Implementation Action Group of the Department of Housing, Planning and Local Government, as well as attending subgroup meetings in relation to homeless children and families. In addition, through one of the sponsors groups under the Department's Better Outcomes, Brighter Futures, we examined the overall provision of services in various government departments, including that of Housing, Planning and Local Government. Furthermore, the Department provides direct support in the context of a specific childcare scheme for those children experiencing homelessness. Free childcare is provided for those children, along with a daily meal for each child. 365 children have been registered for the scheme in the current programme year, which is 2018 to 2019. The Department, with the assistance of colleagues in the Department of Housing, Planning and Local Government, has succeeded in having young adults leaving state care included as a distinct category for funding under the Capital Assistance Scheme. This provides targeted assistance to the most vulnerable of care leavers by enabling approved housing bodies to acquire residential units to accommodate them. Currently, TUSLA, local authorities and AHBs are working in sourcing additional accommodation for this particular cohort under that scheme. As the committee is aware, TUSLA is part of the vote of the Department of Children and Youth Affairs. And maybe in order to provide a flavour of other responses to homelessness under the vote, I'd like to reference a number of headline actions currently being advanced by TUSLA, who I'm sure will provide additional detail on these during the course of our discussions. In brief, TUSLA, through the Family Resource Centres, are supporting the provision of facilities where homeless children and families can avail of a safe and warm environment for homework, for relaxation, etc. TUSLA also assists families experiencing problems with school attendance to the school completion programme. TUSLA works closely with the Dublin Region Housing Executive, with staff providing expertise in relation to child welfare and protection matters, educational welfare and domestic, sexual and gender-based violence services. While government departments and agencies work towards solutions to the current challenge of homelessness, the Department of Children and Youth Affairs, along with colleagues in TUSLA, will continue to offer a range of supports to assist those in coping with such difficulties. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr O'Donoghue. I now call on Mr Gibson to make your opening statement, please.
Chair, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to address the Joint Oireachtas Committee today to discuss issues pertaining to the impact of homelessness on children. I'm conscious of the time and I'll extrapolate the key elements of my opening statement. So, from an agency perspective, we view homelessness as a devastating and unacceptable reality for many families in Ireland. As a state agency established to promote the welfare of children, we urgently see and advocate for the need for a long-term resolution to the crisis, and we are committed to supporting children, parents and communities in dealing with the impact of homelessness on their lives. We see and recognise the courage and resilience of parents and their extended families in supporting their children in the most challenging circumstances, and we, with our partner agencies, wish to support this intent and ensure that these supports are provided at the earliest stage to avoid the family and children experiencing even more difficulties into the future. The short and long-term effects of homelessness on children are well documented and evidenced. The effects span from early childhood right through to adolescence to early adulthood. Homelessness deprives children of the most basic rights and opportunities and things that many of us take for granted in our lives. While the agency does not have a direct role in the provision of housing or accommodation for homeless families, we provide a range of services from prevention and early intervention through to child welfare and at times protection. At all times, we are seeking to help and support children and families to live happy and fulfilled lives, and where difficulties arise, to support them. We manage these difficulties so that the children are not harmed. This, of course, can be more challenging when families are homeless and their ability to maintain connection to extended family and support networks are diminished. Our goal is to try and maintain the integrity of the family while others seek to assist them in finding longer-term housing. Of course, there are occasions where an immediate risk is identified, and in those situations there is an immediate protective response. The Child and Family Agency, TUSLA, is involved in a wide range of integrated approaches and forums. We are committed to the actions that are relevant to the agency in rebuilding Ireland. We work in partnership with the Dublin Region Homeless Executive. We provide funding to non-government organisations across Ireland. The Homelessness Inter-Agency Group, which was established by the Minister for Housing, Planning and Local Government, with senior representations from the key state organisations, we play a role in relation to homelessness, and we're involved with the Joint Consultative Forum in the Dublin Region Homeless Executive. We also use our SIPCs to address some of the help and support mechanisms that we can offer children and families. So finally, while housing and accommodation is not within our remit, we are committed to working in a collaborative way with key partners to ensure children receive the help and support that they require. So I'll just repeat that. While housing and accommodation is not our remit, we are committed to working in a collaborative way with key partners to ensure children receive the supports they require. TUSLA provides a wide range of supports and pathways for families experiencing homelessness, and this is done through early intervention and family supports, established family support networks throughout Ireland, and our education welfare services, and we use the Children and Young People's Services Committees to assist us. With our Family Resource Centre network as well, there are 120 family resource centres around Ireland at this juncture. So TUSLA recognises the huge challenges and the resilience of parents and children, and the essential need for extended families and naturally occurring networks to minimise the impact on children and maintain connections. We are committed to supporting children and families across all levels of need. We are present in every community. We work collaboratively with other organisations to support children and families within a community setting. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. So now we'll move on to members' questions, and members will interact with yourselves. Deputy Neville, you've indicated.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your presentations. Just a couple of questions for the department there. You mentioned in relation to the interagency groups that were established. Once shelter has been provided, what work or what are these agencies meant to be doing after that shelter has been provided, those interagency groups? I'd also like if you could give me something in relation to reduction on lists and housing delivery, where we're at on that, prevention teams, and also the additional posts for HAP and place finders, and a kind of an update on that and where we're at on that. How is that developing? What can be improved in it? Where is it working well? And then in relation to emergency accommodation or rough sleepers, if you could, for my own education, I think myself, in relation to hostels and emergency accommodation, particularly for people with maybe mental health issues or comorbidity issues in relation to mental health and addiction, how that is dealt with, and how. Yeah, I may have supplementary questions. I'd just like to hear that is dealt with first, and I may have supplementary questions after that.
Did you want to come in on that, Ms. Caroline?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Deputy. I suppose I might just take them in order. In terms of the interagency group, I suppose it's very clear homelessness is a very complex issue, and a multi-stranded approach is required, and that's why Minister Murphy established a homeless interagency group, which comprises all of the key stakeholders and players in the game in terms of delivering services. So I suppose our role, and I alluded to it there in my statement in the Department of Housing, relates to the provision of accommodation, quality accommodation and suitable accommodation for families and homeless individuals. But obviously the wraparound supports and the role of other agencies in providing education supports or health supports or child supports is really important. And I suppose bringing the interagency group together, all of the key stakeholders are at the table, and chaired by John Murphy, a report was provided to Minister Murphy and to the Cabinet there last year, which set out a range of recommendations for improved coordination and coherence in terms of state delivery. And Albert has alluded to it there. We're working very closely with the Department of Children in relation to supports. We work with TUSLA. So the interagency group has been a really useful forum in terms of advancing a range of activities. Our colleagues in the Department of Justice are on that group, our colleagues in the Department of Education, and there's a range of issues that we can tease through and work forward in terms of practical delivery. So the housing piece is just one piece. There's lots of other issues that people experiencing homelessness experience. In terms of reductions on our lists, maybe if I move to that, obviously housing supply, and this is very much linked to delivery, is critical to addressing homelessness, and that's why under Rebuilding Ireland we have a very ambitious programme in terms of delivering social housing homes. And we're seeing now the build activity really ramp up, which means that we have homes for people on our housing list and homes for our homeless clients. So last year, for instance, there was 8 times the build delivery achieved than before Rebuilding Ireland. And we're seeing this translate onto housing waiting lists. So we've seen a 22% reduction on the social housing waiting lists. We're also seeing a number of, I've pointed to it there in the statement, we're seeing individuals in homeless accommodation exiting homelessness. Unfortunately, we are still facing the challenge of people coming through the door and families coming through the door. The Minister has brought through recently in the Dáil a range of measures, including reform of the rental sector and the Residential Tenancies Board, Residential Tenancies Bill, will go some way to addressing some of the rental challenges that people are experiencing. But we are seeing an increase in delivery, we are seeing an increase in allocations and the number of families being allocated homes and exits. The challenge for us is obviously to continue our prevention measures, and I think you referred to that there. We've put in place, and we're working with the DRHE in the department, new support officers, homeless, who are working with the DRHE to support families in hotel accommodation, exit the accommodation, to give them advice in relation to what options are there for them. Separately, we have the HAP Place Finder in place, which you've probably all heard of, and 23 local authorities now have HAP Place Finders. And essentially what they are an individual at the local authority who will assist families or individuals find a home, find a private rented accommodation. So there's a range of measures underway. It's not an either-or. As I said earlier on, in terms of delivery, we have obviously the delivery programme of 10,000 homes we deliver this year. We also have families being supported through the housing assistance payment and through the rental accommodation scheme. So they complement each other, and I suppose we're using the maximum amount of measures that we have in order to address homelessness and to find homes for people. I might just refer a little bit there to the rough sleepers, which you asked about, and in relation to the accommodation that we provide for rough sleepers. We have a range of hostels, and again, recently we opened more than another 100 beds. So we're constantly adding to our stock in terms of emergency beds for singles, homeless individuals. The Housing First programme, and again, this kind of ties in the interagency approach. The Housing First programme is obviously the key priority and the critical delivery mechanism, where, you know, the objective is to transition somebody who's in a hostel into independent living with all the wraparound supports from our colleagues in the Department of Health, and where people will get supports in terms of issues such as their mental health and addiction issues. So I suppose in terms of delivery, to summarise, we're seeing progress. We need to do more. 10,000 homes this year will be delivered. And as we get towards the end of Rebuilding Ireland, we'll be delivering 12,000 homes on an annual basis, and that will go out to 2027. Those homes are much needed for families and people on our waiting lists. As I said, the waiting lists are reducing. We've seen them go from over 91,000 down to just 71,000. Our priority will be to continue to try exit as many families as we possibly can and homeless individuals out of emergency accommodation. We know emergency accommodation is not good for people, but we also know that it's necessary at the moment until our supply ramps up and until we find homes for individuals.
Can I just a couple of supplementary questions? In relation to the wraparound supports or interagency, right, you said there was a number of recommendations that came from the report. Were all those implemented? I'll ask you the list. It's probably easier for yourself. Like, were all those recommendations implemented? If not, how many are left and what are they? If you can give us that. How often are these recommendations revised? Obviously, this is quite dynamic and fluid, and I would understand there would have to be an evaluation process, and what that evaluation process is. And are there survey or feedbacks as part of that evaluation process? So that's the first part of that. The second is in relation to HAP. You've spoke about place finders. I don't want to use the word policing, but is there some sort of compliance or checking of compliance in relation to HAP? Because I know my own 99% of landlords there are actually above board. Everything is fine and the tenants have no problem. But I know my own constituency office, I've had people come in on HAP who have been in conditions that haven't been flagged with the local council, and the local council, or the local HAP, sorry, apologies, have been unable to proactively go out and find these places in relation to scrutiny. So it was up to me to make the representation on behalf of the constituents to highlight this and then go through the process, the 2 weeks, the 8 weeks, the 2 weeks, the 2 weeks. Is there any plans from the department in relation to beefing that part of it up? Because if you can understand, there's an end game here in relation to those parts of accommodation that need to be brought up to speed. There's a certain amount, and once they're brought up to speed, that then can drop off, and those skills or whatever those skills are there, or those resources can be put into something else. As I said, it's quite dynamic. And are there any plans around that? Obviously, the other thing that, and it's very difficult to combat, is landlords that are refusing HAP and refusing people on the housing list and to take HAP. And I just want to hear if there's any thoughts around that as well. And finally, in relation to the rough sleepers, the hostels themselves, the actual mechanics of the hostel, particularly when it comes around to comorbidity, mental health and addiction and substance abuse. The hostels there that people would stay in, and I know I'm talking about a cohort here. What type of hostels are they? Are they an open plan type hostel? Is there separate rooms? I mean, I've spoken to rough sleepers and I've actually asked their opinion on this, and I get mixed opinions on it. But it's from my own. What type of hostels? The actual mechanics or the structure of the hostel. That, you know, oftentimes people may be reluctant to go into hostels because they may be recovering, or they may be in recovery, and they may go back in and they may be mixing in an environment or in an area where it may not be good for their mental health as well. So I'm just trying to get an understanding of that, or if any studies have been done around that.
Sure. I might just deal with the HAP piece first, just in relation to the inspections, because you raise a really good point there, and it's something that we're very conscious of in terms of, I mentioned the provision of quality accommodation. There is an inspection regime in place, and HAP properties have to meet the rental standards and requirements of rental legislation, the quality standards. We've done a piece of work around this with the LGMA in terms of the rate of inspections, because we wanted to ensure that there was a significant amount of the required inspections done that were actually done. So we did a piece of work there earlier this year, and we're seeing 83% of the required inspections carried out, and we're following up with local authorities who haven't maybe done the required amount of inspections. They're done on a risk basis, so they're targeted, and it's something that we're reviewing constantly. So the properties do have to meet rental standards. We have put additional resources into local authorities in terms of the inspection regime, and we have done an exercise in terms of the level, monitoring the level to see that local authorities are doing the required amount. So 83% at the moment in terms of that. You asked in relation to the wraparound services and the interagency report. So there was a series of recommendations, and we can provide you with an update on each of those recommendations.
But I'm not looking for the micro part of it. It's just trying to get an overall view if all those recommendations were implemented. Yeah,
they're in the process of being implemented. Some of them are complete. Some of them are more ongoing and long term. So, for instance, in terms of Housing First, there's a National Director of Housing First in place. Yeah. In terms of our work with the Department of Justice, there's protocols in place in terms of youth offenders, in terms of interaction there. In terms of our activity with the Department of Children, we have a range of supports, and we've brought forward a range of services with the Department of Children. CAS funding, for instance, is now provided to support youth. Do
you have a timeline of? Sorry for interjecting. Yeah. No, I'm conscious of my time. Do you have a timeline of when all those recommendations will be implemented?
We would obviously like to have them implemented all as soon as possible. Some of them are continuous, so we want them implemented as soon as possible. I could say to you probably half of them are now already implemented, but some of them are just ongoing. Just in relation to monitoring the implementation of that particular plan, it is an area that the Taoiseach has taken an interest in, and it has been part of it. It's regularly provided updates at Cabinet committees. So the work of all of the departments together is reflected in that for us. So it's being monitored at government level and also within our own department. It's independently chaired, as I said, by John Moran, former Secretary General, who reports to our own Minister.
Okay. And the final part was on the rough sleepers?
Oh, rough sleepers, and in relation to the hostels.
Yeah.
So I suppose in terms of the hostels, we have a range of hostels, and we have a range of facilities. In the last number of years, I'd say there's been approximately 500 additional beds put into the system. As we move forward, we're modernising all of our hostels, and there's a range of supports and services in place in those hostels. People can, from Safety Net, they'll receive medical supports, they'll be able to engage with counsellors, they'll be able to engage with people in relation to their addictions. So we have an ongoing programme of refurbishment of our existing hostels, but also an expansion programme in terms of the number of units. I think you raised the issue of drug, was it?
Yeah, comorbidity, mental health and substance.
Mental health and substance. So obviously in terms of mental health, as I referred to earlier on, the Housing First programme is critical. In terms of mental health supports, within the structures and within the hostels, people receive supports in terms of mental health and also in terms of addiction. And I mean, they regularly would have HSC intervention, and also through the local authorities would work with them in relation to putting in place the required supports in that area.
Okay. Yeah, just one final point that I'm done then, okay?
I have to move on to
I understand, just in relation to, I just want to mention about HAP that the majority of landlords that I do meet and the majority of tenants I do meet are complying. And I want to be, that's from my experience, are complying. I'm speaking about a small cohort. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I suppose what strikes me about the three presentations that are made, and I'm just going to paraphrase it a little bit back to you. This is from TUSLA. While the agency does not have a direct role in the provision of housing and accommodation for homeless families, we provide a range of services. And then from the Department of Children and Youth Affairs, you go, as members of the committee are aware, responsibility for addressing homelessness rests with the Department of Housing and Planning and Local Government. And then from the Housing Department, you go, I think it's important to note that the Department of Housing, Planning and Local Government is responsible for the provision of a national framework policy, legislation and funding to underpin the role of housing authorities in addressing homelessness. Statutory responsibility lies with the housing authorities. So there's one people missing in front of me here today, and that's the local authorities, because that's where the statutory responsibility lies, and it's not till that presentation and you read through it do you realise where it actually lies. So I think Deputy Neville asked some really interesting questions, and I'm not going to go back over them, but what I would like to know is, how often do all these various departments meet? The question I want to know is that in relation, these include, in September 2017, Minister Murphy established the Homeless Interagency Group, but we know then you presented it in 2018. Since 2018's presentation, which was last June, how many times have you met since? Because I have no figures. The whole presentation, while it's excellent, it's very wordy, I don't have one figure to back up a thing. So I'll ask that question, I'll ask for a response. And it's, yeah.
Deputy, the group meets approximately every 2 months.
So who sits at that group then? Thank you very much. So every 2 months. So when was the last time you met? And how many times this year have you met?
The last meeting was in June. It was a meeting in, I think, April and February, but I can send on the details.
That's okay. And what department sits at that meeting?
So the Department of Housing, Planning and Local Government.
Yep.
Department of Employment Affairs and Social Protection.
Right.
Department of Health. HSE.
Yep.
Dublin Regional Homeless Executive.
Yep.
The City and County Management Association. Yep. Department of Education and Skills.
Department of Children.
Department of Children, Youth Affairs, TUSLA, And I think that's about it.
All right, that's okay then.
Department of Justice as well, sorry.
All right, thank you. That's just important to know that that's up and running. So who is responsible then for gathering the data? Tusla, Jim, do you gather the data in relation to children do you have mandatory reporting where there's welfare issues? Is there calls coming into the Tusla offices? And how do you gather that data? Do county councils pick up the phone? Do schools pick up the phone? Are you getting to your various family resource centres, to your own offices in the various regions? Is there calls coming in and is there data being gathered?
Deputy, our response was to appoint a homeless liaison officer who would be the connection to enhance integration with regards to families who present as homelessness, either in emergency accommodation or in the hubs as an interim solution to homelessness. So we would pick up and we would strengthen our integration with the key organisations that were mentioned in providing and signposting help and support the services. We also spent time training personnel within the hubs across the country with regards to referral pathways into Tusla. As a state agency for child protection and welfare, it's not we don't and we would never wish the connection between homelessness and child protection. Yep. But there are the staff involved with homeless families have the pathways and know the referral pathways for a child protection issue if it does arise.
All right. So I go back to my question again. I now know you have one designated person with supports in various hubs. How many? Where is the data being collected? In
respect of families referred as homeless?
Yeah, as homeless, or schools referring, or GPs referring. Where's the data being gathered where families are being flagged?
Yeah. We have specific metrics, Deputy, that you're aware of, and we presented to the committee before in relation to the matters that we receive. We don't count homelessness at this juncture because it is a child protection issue. It's a lot more than just it's about the needs of a child in respect of abuse or neglect.
But with the height of respect, is welfare not part of the child protection issues? The welfare of the child, where the child sleeps and having a roof over their head and having proper, sustainable meals, is that a welfare issue?
Right. I'll bring my colleague in.
Yes, Deputy, we do. As you know, we produce quarterly and annual reports in relation to our services we provide and particular metrics. So we do report on categories of child abuse cases and welfare cases in our responses. Most people that refer to us, though, are not referring on the issues primarily of homelessness. They're referring about the impact of homelessness on the child. So they may identify a child as a particular need. They may identify a child needs particular, or a parent needs particular family support. So we publish information around the number of family support services we provide, the number of families in family support services, the number of children.
That's exactly what I'm looking for. So what do you do with that information when that call comes in? Because you are gathering the data. So that person who has made that phone call, is there interagency collaboration then with your local authority?
Absolutely, there's interagency collaboration. Jim,
so maybe if I describe what we have invested in over the last 5 years, we developed our prevention, partnership and family support services, which we feel is very well positioned to assist and help families that find themselves in homelessness, either in emergency accommodation, hotel environment, or in a family hub. The homeless liaison officer is the link to services that we have already established. So across Ireland, we have family support networks which are multidisciplinary and interagency for us that fit into the child and young person services committees. So we have lots of support people in our organisation across Ireland and in the major cities. That is where we see the real important connection for families, because let's remember, lots of these families are respectable, they're resilient, they're resourceful, they're good parents, they have clear attachments and clear bonds with their children. What they need is help in the circumstances that they find themselves in. So, for example, no place to play, no place to cook, are important things. So we work with strategic partners across Ireland to ensure that families have somewhere to go to do some basic things like wash clothes, to have space for homework clubs, to look at activities that are based, because if children, particularly in the emergency hotel environment, they're trying to keep their children quiet, they can't play, they're in confined spaces, parents don't have that private space to have a discussion about things. So we work through our family support network, which is really well established. We give information to the committee before that we have 120 family support networks around. We have family support coordinators who engage with families, but also families that are homeless. And what we hear from families that are homeless, they don't want the flag up saying I'm homeless. And in the Ombudsman for Children's report, children spoke about their experiences of being homeless and the shame and how they manage that within a day-to-day place. We work also with our Education Welfare Service, School Completions Programme, the Homeschool Liaison, where there's reporting of non-school attendance. We're sympathetic and we work with parents and we engage with parents on how we can resolve those problems of non-attendance at school. So the family support service is set up to listen to parents and children as opposed to prescribing how we can fix the challenges that they have in homelessness. So, Deputy, you're aware of my world triangle that we use as a methodology to engage with parents and children about how they perceive their needs and how they describe their needs to us, and we describe what services are there that we can connect them with to assist them in any of the issues that they express.
I thoroughly agree on everything you're saying, and that is as is. There's not an issue there. But
Yes.
my issue is, going back again, is how do you engage with the local authority, because they have the statutory responsibility for delivery.
Deputy, we engage with homeless families where they present.
All right. Do you engage with the local authorities?
Of course, yes, and we have people that are involved with the local authorities and sit on Rebuilding Ireland and make commitments to those actions as well. So there is an interagency, a very integrated approach, and we're very clear in those forums what our role is in that matter, and our role is to help families that are homeless. It's not defined. We advocate strongly, social workers and social care workers across Ireland will advocate strongly for families who are homeless by way to social protection or to the local authority, and write and support their clients' requirements in respect of housing
So when you
needs.
talk about hubs, what is the feedback you're getting from parents that engage with your support workers that are involved in hubs?
As I stated in the written statement to the Oireachtas, we view the interim measure as hubs as a valuable step in the right direction, because it grounds children and families in a place where we can ensure that, from a support and helping perspective, that they continue to have that connection from their community, and we can arrange schooling. And a good initiative was the LEAP card for families who are homeless to get to school. We use our Education Welfare Service, who negotiate with schools different starting times and leaving times. We also accommodate parents who bring children, as they're not standing outside in the gate, that they have somewhere of comfort to go to wait for their children, because they may have to wait for an hour or so. So we are clear that the hubs are an interim measure, worthwhile. It allows us to give stability to families, but also to create the pathways to all the services, the universal services that any family requires, i.e. primary care within the HSC and family support services that are in that community and are coordinated.
Last
Yeah,
question, and it really is for the department. Thank you very much. But that leads on. The word was interim, all right? So what does the department see as an interim measure for families in hubs? Like, we've had so many presentations here and everybody was saying 6 months was as long as they should be there. Like, what's the stats from the department? How long are families experiencing having to live in hubs? And what is the pathway?
So it depends on the particular family. So we have 27 hubs in place at the moment, catering for around 660 families. So we're seeing in some hubs the move-on rate is anything between 2 to 3 months. And then we're seeing some families stay a bit longer, maybe over 6 months, where they're getting supports and where they're getting services in the hub, and they're not moving on as quickly. We're working with those families, and that's why within the hubs we have place finders, we have supports in place to help people find accommodation. So when somebody goes into a hub, we intensely work with them straight on the day they go in to give them the suite of options in terms of move on, so that they can get a longer term tenancy. So there is that engagement. Some of them move on quicker, and there are some families with complex issues that do remain in the hub. They have wraparound supports there, and it takes a little bit longer maybe to provide a specialist piece of accommodation for those particular group. But we are seeing move-ons from 3 months, so we're seeing anything between 3 to 6 months families move out of hubs. But there are families who do stay longer in hubs, and that's because we have to tailor-make a particular solution for those families. Larger families, for instance, can be challenging in terms of finding accommodation.
Thank you. I'll have to allow other speakers in at this point. Deputy O'Sullivan, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for all of your presentations. I suppose I'm maybe continuing on from Deputy Rabbitte to some extent. And one of you mentioned the Ombudsman for Children's report, I think it was Mr Gibson. I mean, that report has very clearly shown the long-term damage that's done to children when they spend any length of time in homeless services, whether that be a hub or a hotel or wherever. And indeed, there have been other reports as well. And it's not just that they feel ashamed that they're in a hub. They actually are restricted in terms of their physical growth and their ability to socialise and all of the other things that are so important to a child. So I suppose, I mean, I don't know whether you can answer this question, Mr Gibson, but does TUSLA have a position on whether there should be a time limit spent in homeless services for children? Now, that may well be a policy area that you can't comment on, but I mean, I would have thought that, you know, because you are the body that looks after the welfare of children, that you would have at least some, I suppose, position on it. So maybe that's my first question, because my concern really is that more and more we're seeing a focus on managing homelessness rather than eradicating homelessness, and I'll come to the department on that in a few minutes, Department of Housing. But I just, at this stage, I mean, we've had lots of recommendations that there should be time limits, and indeed, when Rebuilding Ireland was first published, it was meant to end the use of hotels by the July after the publication of Rebuilding Ireland. So maybe if you can answer that question, Mr Gibson.
Deputy, in my opening statement, we made it quite clear with regards to the devastating and unacceptable consequences of homelessness on children. You're asking me, is there a policy statement on the time, an acceptable time that children and families are in a homelessness space? We don't have a policy on that. We would like to see the situation eradicated from Ireland as quickly as possible. We see the hub as an interim measure, probably the best solution at this juncture. Feel we could build on that, you know, to ensure that the most important thing is that we try and assure that children's life within a community and where their home was is sort of maintained, with the view that those children and their families can be accommodated back within their community, where their extended family, their friends, their school, their sporting interests, hobbies, interests can be reignited, and that's a really important thing. We don't have a policy on the duration. Maybe we should, and maybe we should look at that internally and in collaboration with other state agencies. We are all accepting that it's, you know, a dreadful place for children and families to be, and what services that we have are really tailored to engage with children and families, to listen to them and assist them to define their challenges, their complexities. That doesn't diminish their independence within a homelessness state. So that's vitally important for us from a value base, in relation to our mission and our values of TUSLA. And that's reflected even in our child protection services. Our science and safety is more about engagement with children and families and helping them find the solutions within that dialogue and that sort of practice framework.
Well, I think I would welcome if you are able to push the boat out in terms of your own responsibilities and actually develop some policy in that area, because I think it's vital that we have that sort of, I suppose, pressure, and it has come from other sources, to actually get people out of home, our families in particular, and the 3,749 children that are homeless in the last figures, to get them moved on as quickly as possible. So I'm going to go to Mary Hurley next, because
you know, as Deputy Rabbitte said, and you've said, the statutory responsibility is with local authorities, but local authorities basically, you know, the root cause, and you said as well, is shortage of supply. But the local authorities need to be funded in order to supply the social housing. Now, I'm not talking about HAP and so on, I'm not talking about the revenue side of it. I think the really crucial side of it is the actual delivery of social houses through the councils, through voluntary housing associations, but also the void scheme, which, and maybe you can answer me directly on that, there seem to be less council houses now being returned through the void scheme in the last year. And I still, certainly, I'm sure other public representatives, I still see empty local authority houses all around me that have been empty for long periods of time. So maybe you can give me a direct answer on that, because it is a way of providing homes quickly for people who are on social housing lists. And also, you did give us a figure for the amount spent this year on the Exchequer allocation of 146 million for homeless services. But I just wanted to ask you about the use of the budget for construction, because we are certainly getting we're getting stories from local authorities that they're waiting for approval to move on to particularly construction phase of council homes and apartments and houses, and that it seems to be stuck. So is there an issue there in terms of releasing funding for councils to do their job, which is to provide housing? And just thirdly, can I ask you about the traveller budget, because consistently those budgets have been underspent by some local authorities in particular, and there are hearings actually in the Shannon today in relation to travellers, and I know, because I've been on the cross-party group, that the issue of spending the allocation for traveller accommodation is an issue that comes up all of the time. And I think probably from my own, again, personal experience, a lot of those larger families that are stuck in emergency housing or in hubs and hotels, a lot of them are traveller families, because some of the traveller families are still quite large. Certainly, again, I know traveller families that have been in hotels for quite some time now. So maybe if you can just give me some answers on those ones.
Thanks, Deputy. I might touch on the voids issue first, and then I can deal with the delivery piece. Just in relation to the voids, as you know, under Rebuilding Ireland, there's a various blend of delivery. And as the programme rolls out, less void units were being counted in terms of delivery. This year, 303 void units will be counted for the purposes of Rebuilding Ireland. However, the department is funding much more than that, and we will be issuing approvals to local authorities over the coming days in relation to that. So absolutely agree with you. It makes absolute sense where you have a unit that can be brought back into stock really quickly for less than it would cost to do a build. It's a no-brainer, so absolutely we're working with local authorities in relation to voids. What we're also doing, though, is putting a planned maintenance programme in place, and there's a lot of work underway with the CCMA so that the stock that we have is maintained, and we don't get to a stage where when somebody exits or leaves a void that there's so much work to be done to it. So I think there's a two-pronged approach there. For the purposes of Rebuilding Ireland, we'll be counting so many. However, we'll still fund local authorities, bring back really useful units into use.
So just
for
on
families.
the planned maintenance, do they have to get that funding out of their own general?
So we're working with them in relation
there isn't a
to
specific fund.
Well, they obviously they get differential rent, and they should be putting that back into maintaining their
Because again,
stock.
I think
But we're
experience
also,
would suggest that a lot of them are not really putting very much money into.
So there's really good work, collaborative work, been done between the local authorities and the department at the moment in relation to putting a robust programme in place,
I look forward to seeing that.
and around funding as well. So I think we're all on the same page on that one. Voids are a really useful way of housing families. I might just go back a little bit to, you talked about exiting families from emergency accommodation and the time frame. The service providers that operate the hubs, there are service level agreements in place which the target would be to have a family moved on from after 6 months out of a hub. Again, I've spoken about there are particular families that maybe that's not possible. In terms of monitoring the move-on rate, we know that the Peter McVerry Trust, who operate a number of our hubs, 6 months is the average time and they move people on. We know Respond, who run a number of hubs as well, theirs is between 6 and 7 months. So we are seeing people moving on. Sometimes it just takes time to set people up, and they need some care and they need some support in the family hub, and they're then ready to move on. So that's obviously, we try to move people on as quickly as we can. Just, I suppose, just to give a flavour maybe of, we talk about exits and we talk about homelessness and trying to move people on. Just maybe if we look at Dublin for the first 5 months of this year, and I think this just gives a picture of the, I suppose, the inputs and the outputs and people moving through the system. So we would have had 899 families present in Dublin between January and May. 462 of them were prevented from entering emergency accommodation, and 404 families exited emergency accommodation, and there were 1,644 dependents associated with that cadre of people. So, you know, what we're really seeing at the moment is for every family that presents, one is prevented. We see an exit of another family per month, and then we're seeing another family go into emergency accommodation. So it's very much a moving piece. So look, you're absolutely right, delivery is the way to go. Last year we delivered significant supports to over 27,000 supports to families, of which 7,000 or 8,422 were through build, acquisition and leasing. This year we'll deliver 10,000. So that'll be 10,000 sets of keys for families at the end of this year. So we're ramping up, and we know it's the way to go in terms of exiting people from homelessness.
And the traveller budget?
Traveller accommodation, I'm going to ask my colleague David to talk to that.
Yeah, the traveller accommodation budget, I suppose there's been a challenge there in getting the budget fully spent. So every year the department would seek proposals from the local authorities and allocate funding to each local authority. And I suppose the spend has been disappointing. In 2018, the spend was up 25% on the previous year to about 6 million, but that was from a budget allocation of 12 million. So, I mean, it's in the programme for government, there was a commitment to analyse this, and the housing agency had actually commissioned a review to look at the delays in delivering traveller-specific accommodation projects. On foot of that report, the National Traveller Consultative Committee, which is a statutory committee, established under the Traveller Accommodation Act, advised the Minister that there was I suppose a need for some independent thinking in this, and an independent expert group was established by Minister English in late 2018. So that expert group will be submitting a report to the Minister this month. It's looking at the barriers to deliver traveller accommodation and making some recommendations. How do we address those barriers, and how do we improve the delivery of traveller accommodation? So they'll be looking at the legislation, the Housing Traveller Accommodation Act, but also other related legislations and policies. I know planning is one of the issues that was considered. So the Minister has committed to bringing forward the relevant policy, including legislation, to give rise to the recommendations in that report. So I think hopefully we'll have some policy responses in the department in the autumn.
Okay, thank you. Have I time to ask one short question, Mr. O'Donoghue?
Yeah.
It's just, you mentioned, Mr. O'Donoghue, about children leaving state care. You mentioned a programme, so could you give us a little more on that?
Thank you, Deputy. When the interagency structures were originally put in place by colleagues in housing planning and local government, we, from our perspective, realised there was an opportunity to expand the current capital acquisition scheme to include the cohort, a very small cohort, it must be said. I think it's in the region of 5–6% of care leavers annually who may be at risk of homelessness. And what the expansion provided by Mary, David and colleagues in the department allows us to do is draw down capital funding with approved housing bodies to provide accommodation for that particular cohort of young people. So those designated units would be for young people leaving state care.
Okay. So we could probably get some figures on it later. I know my time has run out.
Thank you.
Of course,
Mr. Gibson, you wanted to interject briefly? Yeah.
I think the CAS programme has been highly successful. We have 50 properties with specific agencies purchased for young people leaving care in Ireland, and that we do have a very comprehensive aftercare service now. We have good legislation and good regulation and good policy within TUSLA. We have good aftercare services within TUSLA across Ireland, and we've also commissioned some non-government organisations to provide some level of service there as well. And the numbers are exceptionally good with regards to the aftercare provision, and in many circumstances we have young people remaining with their carers, foster carers, in an aftercare arrangement. But also we're very proud of the fact that 64% of young people leaving care are in higher education or a good training programme. And that's a really good statistic for us. So, I just wanted you to be aware of some of those facts. Yeah.
Ms. Hurley wanted to come in.
Just really quickly, because you asked in relation to approving projects and funding projects, just to say our budget this year is €2.4 billion for housing, and to date already this year we've provided 890 million for a range of housing activities and capital works across the country, and that's supporting 322 projects with over 5,600 homes on site at the moment, and we've 20,000 build units in the pipeline. So the funding is in place. You'll be aware, Deputy, and we've discussed it before, there's been a lot of discussion around the four-stage approval process, and we have reviewed that process in the department, and we're working very, very closely with local authorities to meet the time frame for moving projects as quickly as possible through the system. So we are working well together with the local government system, and where issues arise, we try and move them along as quickly as possible while always ensuring value for money.
Yeah, I'm just conscious that Deputy Mitchell has to get in, so perhaps you could introduce
Just a
it.
small point, just in relation to the CAS scheme. Just in May of 2019, there was 24 care leavers that availed of that service, so 15 through Focus Ireland, 6 through Peter McVerry, and 3 through Don Bosco. Just specifically on that, just to give you that detail.
Thank you. Deputy Mitchell.
Thanks, Chair. I just have a few brief questions because my colleagues covered a lot of stuff here. But in the Ombudsman report for children, the report said that children were expressing sadness, confusion, anger, isolation. And I think you'd all agree with us that that's pretty tough on kids. So I want to ask you, what sort of monitoring is being done in these hubs regarding children's mental health? First off, that would be the first one. And then to lie on that, I want to know, is there any measures being taken to reduce the stigma for homeless children? You can start off with them first.
First of all, Deputy Mitchell, I suppose the interagency group has been examining the recommendations of the report made by the Ombudsman. Obviously, a very important report given the reliance the Department has on hubs at the moment. And I think in the first instance, I suppose there'd be concern about some of the issues that have been raised in terms of the impact on children. So the interagency group, I mean, one of the key things is to make sure that we have the link just between homeless services and services in the community. So in Dublin, for example, where the majority of the hubs are, the family action team would make sure that the children and the families in the hubs are linked into health services. So if children need support, health supports due to their mental health, they'll be linked into health services. The other issue we're examining is the supports provided in the hubs, and that's something we're continuing to examine closely with TUSLA and the local authorities in particular.
Right. So, okay, on that, we had Focus Ireland in, and they had stressed to us that there was a shortage of child support workers They said that there was a waiting list for families in hubs to link in with a child support worker. So I want to know what's being done in around that issue. And they made a special, they couldn't speak highly enough of the need for therapeutic supports for children who are in hubs. So I want to know what has happened since that. Is there a shortage, number one, in child support workers? If there is, what's being done about it? We have the Department of Children and Youth Affairs here. Are you willing to make extra funding available in the budget to make sure that these children are getting the supports needed, particularly in around therapeutic supports?
Deputy, maybe I would be reasonably placed to deal with the issue of child support workers. TUSLA provided two posts to Focus Ireland in respect of family support workers. But with reference to my earlier contribution to the discussion, I would like to have an engagement with Focus Ireland to actually sort of map out across all communities in Ireland what supports are actually there. We invest heavily in the community and voluntary sector for specific family support programmes, counselling services, and we, as I said earlier, we have a very comprehensive family support service in place across Ireland, that is down in a community-based level, which requires greater integration and collaboration from all organisations across the social and health services. So I think we need not to be running away with ourselves, and we need to have an informed position with regards to, do we need a whole raft of more family support workers, and do an engagement. I'd be very happy to have an engagement with Focus Ireland.
You contacted Focus Ireland?
We have a service level agreement with Focus Ireland. We are a key funder to Focus Ireland. We fund Focus Ireland to 3.5 million per annum. So you know they need to be conforming with all the elements of our agency from the Child Protection and Welfare Service. The majority of that funding is for aftercare services, but certainly, Deputy Mitchell, we do have an engagement with them. I'm saying here today, I would like to have another engagement with them in respect of services for homeless children in homelessness. And what I'm saying is that there's quite a substantial investment, not just from TUSLA, but also from the HSE and other state agencies in services that are in existence in lots of communities. And I feel that, you know, we need to have a coordinated response, integrated response to helping children and families that are in homeless situations. So there's a good example with regards to a model that we have developed in the Wellview Family Resource Centre, and I believe the Minister for Children and Youth Affairs was out at that programme and spoke highly of the involvement of the programme that was set up there, providing practical supports and help, but also being able to give very specific services and signpost them to more therapeutic counselling service as required.
Are you happy that you have sufficient funding? Do you think TUSLA is funded sufficiently with this crisis?
Sure. You know, we enter into an estimates process with the department every year, and we define our ask within the department. And you know, given the economic situation and stuff, we're very clear about our key priorities as Child Protection and Welfare Service in Ireland. And you know, we look and we ask government for further investment. Over the last 3 years, we have had significant investment, and you know, we are challenged at times with the recruitment, and we were in with the committee in relation to social work as a profession. But it's not just social work that makes up the staffing in relation to TUSLA.
Can I just ask, one of the main things that was coming up all through these hearings was the difficulties that families were facing in the summer period with children, right? So I want to ask, while we have you all there together, what have you done to help these families through these difficulties? They have asked consistently, this committee wrote to the Minister for the LEAP card to be made available to children, not just in the summer period, but October through midterm, so these children can still participate in activities. So these children can still travel to areas to visit their friends, so they're not isolated, they're not feeling alone. Now, we've been banging our heads off a brick wall Last week the Minister made an announcement, it's available. But it was available to every child for July. So I'm asking you here now, children who are homeless will not have free travel in August, they won't have it in October, they don't have it in December and so on. So collectively, the departments here, can you actually knock your heads together and please even sort this out, that we can make at least one small thing available for these children?
Is that something that could be covered by the interagency meeting that you have on a relatively regular basis? Could that be an agenda item for that meeting?
Yeah, I think maybe just to Deputy, the DRHE do put a lot of work into arranging activities for families in the summer, and we can maybe provide the committee with some details.
I think we should, because it was coming consistently from groups coming in front of us that this is a period, like there's no support for them. There's children now and young teenagers sitting in hubs now, you know, they're away from friends, they're isolated. So I think that if this stuff is available, it needs to be made available. People need to know, instead of everybody all sitting happy clappy, or we're doing A, B, C and D. And these families don't know this is happening. So I would welcome that, even if you could share that information with us now, it would be important.
Yeah, Deputy, I know from our discussions with the DRHE that they do make efforts to make recreational activities available to children during the summer, and various outreach to various events. And I think we can provide a note to the committee on that. And
on the leave cards,
there's no current information about it. What Deputy Mitchell is asking is there anything currently happening as regards making the leave cards available? I didn't mean to prevent them asking that question. I was trying to be helpful. Yeah.
In terms of the leap card, at the moment the leap card is an initiative for school-going children. I know that I think it's Transport Ireland have made free travel for children in the month of July. But at the moment, in terms of the various resource demands, there's no immediate decision on extending the leap card funding at present.
It is something that could
be
looked at. I mean, how does something come onto the agenda for your multi, because it is obviously Department of Transport, but it's multi-departmental in a sense.
Yeah, it's funded, Chair, through the homeless budget, through the funding under the Section 10 of the Housing Act at the moment. And there are quite a lot of pressures on the funding there at the moment, so it's something that we could consider in the light of available funding.
Okay, perhaps between the different departments. Deputy Mitchell.
Yeah, that's disappointing, because that wasn't the response the Minister gave us from the floor last week. He actually said it was something that he was seriously going to look at, and I think other deputies will support me on that. So it seems that departments and the Minister are giving two different answers here, so hopefully we can address
Deputy,
that.
sorry, I'm not...
Information have filtered through, through to the different departments. Yeah.
I'm certainly not contradicting the Minister and the Department, certainly, if the Minister is considering it. I'm just saying here today I'm not in a position to commit funding to it.
Hopefully you can bring it back to your next meeting. But then, just lastly, sorry for hogging this a bit, but the Department of Housing there, you say that 6 months is could you tell us what is the longest stay that you have families in a hub or a hotel? Because I think there's deputies around this table here who know that we have got people a lot longer than 6 months, a lot longer than a year staying, and you're saying it's not possible to move these families. Would you admit it's not possible because we're not building social housing for these families to go into?
I don't think it's I think it's very complex in terms of the allocation of homes. So there's obviously a system of allocations, and there are people on a waiting list, and we're obviously trying to move people out of homeless accommodation as well. So it's not as straightforward as simply just building houses and moving people out of hotels. You're absolutely right. In some circumstances, there are some families in hotels much longer than 6 months, and it could be up to 2 years for some families. They may have a particular need, they may have a particular specialist requirement. Sometimes we see a reluctance in some families in emergency accommodation to leave the emergency accommodation and go into the HAP scheme. So there's a range of things happening. Sometimes the family is very large. There could be multiple children, and it's very hard to accommodate them. So it's not as straightforward. What I can say to you is that we really do work hard in the DRHE, and we work with all of the regional leads and the housing authorities across the country to move people on as quickly as possible. And as I say, in terms of delivery, we're all agreed. Supply is the key to this, and that's why we are ramping up, and that's why we are accelerating delivery, and that's why the funding's in place, and we are trying to move as quickly as we can, and that's why we're streamlining our processes. But we also have to deliver quality homes for families. So we are all agreed we want to move people out and families out of hotel accommodation as quickly as possible. But you're absolutely right. In some circumstances, it is harder to move on some families, and we want to move families on to the right home with the right supports. And in some circumstances, families are not in a position to move out of emergency accommodation because they still need the particular supports that are provided to them through the housing authority in that accommodation. But we're working very hard, and local authorities are working very hard to exit families. And as I said to you there earlier on, in terms of when you look at the numbers, you know, we're preventing 1 in every 2 families go into emergency accommodation. We're exiting a family, and unfortunately, some families are going into emergency accommodation. But I think you raised some really good points in relation to the type of services that should be provided to families over the summer, and we will get you that note. But we know there's sports clubs, there's events organised for families throughout the summer.
Thank you. And Deputy Rabbitte, you wanted to interject briefly?
That remark that Deputy Mitchell made, and it was about 2 weeks ago over in Buswells. There was a presentation being given, and one of the asks was in relation to families in housing emergency accommodation for the summer months. And I came up with a suggestion, maybe it's something you could bring back to your steering group, was we've over 10,000 OPW sites right across this country. They are owned by the department. Why can't we give visitor cards to those families? So they're educational, they're practical, they're embedded in our community, and they could be free. So families could go in and use them, and actually it would be a day out. And I think they're everywhere, and we don't need to look for specific approval on it. It's covered by the department. It's a matter of just whatever card you can put in place. That can happen at a request.
Thank you very much, Deputy. And thank you to all of you for coming in and presenting to us today. We really appreciate the information and the interaction with members. So the meeting of the Joint Committee is now adjourned sine die. Thank you.